Let's take a look at some of the different rectangle APIs that are available and how we can use those in different ways. So to start off, you'll see that I already have a canvas defined and I have a window on load I'm going to use. So we'll do the normal find the canvas routine. So we'll do document get element by ID, and we'll get the context. So we have our paintbrush that we can render with, and we'll get the 2D context. Alright, so from here in Module 1 I showed an example of how you can draw a rectangle. So I'm going to show that real quick, but show a couple options you can do with some other APIs. So one of the first things we can do is use the context to actually come in and fill a rectangle. And we can give it the XY coordinates of where it should go. So if we want to go, for instance, 10 in and maybe 50 pixels down, we can then come in and give it a width. And let's go ahead and say 100. And maybe 200 for the height. And what that'll do, because I haven't defined anything else, is use black as the actual color. So if we go ahead and launch this in Chrome, we'll see that we get a very simple rectangle on our canvas. Now, of course, we can come in and we can use different properties, and one of those is the actual fill style. So let's go ahead and make this, say, navy blue. We'll save that and run it again, and we can change the color. So that's very similar to what we saw earlier. Now we can also come in though and do stroke rect, and if we run this, because I didn't define the actual stroke style, you'll see that when we launch it here, we just kind of get what would be a black type of stroke. And let me go ahead and move this up just a little bit. Let's run that one more time. And there we go. So you can see that we have the stroke coming down, but we haven't defined a color. So we can simply say stroke style is navy. And now once we run it, you'll see that we kind of get a navy blue type of stroke that's going on here. Alright, so that's an example. Now you'll notice it's cut off a little bit, and that's mainly because the height is 200, and you'll notice that the rectangle is 200, so we can of course easily change that. And we'll launch it again, and now we should see the whole thing that is stroked. So that's kind of the difference between them. Now what we can do is combine these. So I can actually come in, and let's say that we do want a fill style, and we want that to maybe be green. We want the stroke style, let's change that to black. And what I can do is actually do both. So we can come in and say fill rect, and that's going to use our fill style of green. But we can also come in and say stroke. Now, one way we could also handle this is to just say rect, and that'll draw a rectangle, but then we'd have to call the fill and the stroke. So we fill it and then we stroke it. But let's go ahead and go back to what I had first, and we'll show that. Alright, so let's go ahead and run this. And you'll see that we now have the green, but we don't actually have much for the stroke that we can see. So we can come on in and we can do a stroke rect. We'll give the exact same dimensions and we'll run that. And it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see that it almost looks like a shadow around the outer border of this. So that's an example of some of the basic things you can do. And of course, as I mentioned, we can even come in and do something like this, where we define a rectangle, but we don't actually fill it at the definition. We just say, here's a rectangle, now let's fill it, and stroke it. So we'll go ahead and launch this now. And you'll see we get the exact same type of output. So we can define it that way, we could use the fill rect, we could use the stroke, we can do those types of different things. So that's just a simple example of getting started with some of the different APIs that are available. Now let's do something a little more realistic though. So what I'd like to do is create a really simple bar chart and demonstrate using the APIs available for rectangles to do something a little more creative and involved. Now it's going to be very straightforward and it'll be easy to follow for you. So we're going to start off by coming in and I'm going to create an array, and let's call this scores. And the array is just going to have some different values. So let me throw in a couple test scores here. Something like that. And what we're going to do is iterate through these scores, and each one will show a bar. So the 100 will have a higher bar, the 90 will be slightly lower, and so on and so forth. And then each bar in the chart is going to have a width, and let's go ahead and set that to about 50. And then we have to start, where does the first bar go? I'm going to call that current X, and you're going to see in a moment I'm going to increment that by a few pixels so that we don't have bars overlaying each other. Now the final thing I want to set is what's the base of where the different bars are going to start from. Now this is going to present an interesting little problem because you're going to see that with the Rectangle API, everything draws from top down, but if you think about a bar chart, I actually want my columns to be at the bottom and then go up. And so we're going to have to do a little bit of just some basic math to handle this, but we're going to set that we want 200 pixels down to be the starting point of our particular chart. Now the next thing I'm going to do is let's go ahead and set the fill style of each of the bars to green. And what's nice about this is as I draw each bar, I certainly could do different colors. For instance, based on a range, maybe the everything in the 90 range is a green and everything in the 80 range is purple or something like that. But we're going to go ahead and do green in this particular example. Now next thing I'm going to do is iterate through the scores. So let's go ahead and iterate while the I variable here is less than the scores.length, and we'll increment by 1. Alright, so there's our simple loop. Now from here, I need to grab the actual score because that's going to represent the height of each bar. So we're going to assume that 100 is the highest, and then in this case 45 it looks like would be the lowest. So I'm going to grab the height of each bar, and we're going to do that by simply going into the scores. We'll grab scores I. From here I now have everything I need. I have the starting X position of the bar, and I have the height of the bar, as well as the width of the bar. So now we can use the fill rect by simply saying context.fillRect, as you saw earlier, and I'm going to give it current X, and I'm going to give it the height, the width, and then the H, which is our scores I. Alright, so basically we're going to start off by saying where it gets positioned. We're going to say current X, we're going to start at 50, do the height, do the width, and then the height of the bar is going to represent how high it goes, and in this case the height is going to represent the Y. Now you're going to see in a moment this isn't going to work out quite like we want, but we'll come back and fix it. Now as we loop through, we need to move our bars starting from left and then move them over to the right. So we're going to take current X, and we're going to grab the width, which is 50, and let's go ahead and just add a few pixels. This will be the gap that shows between the bars, and we'll go ahead and save that. So let's come up and run it, and let's see what we have at this point. And you'll see that we do get some bars, and it's a start, but it's certainly not what we're after. This bar here, for instance, which was the 90, I believe, should obviously be somewhere down here. So if the base was here at 200, this bar needs to be flat with this one, so that it has a little bit of a gap, and then obviously this one up here should actually be right in that area. So we need to just subtract the difference from the 200 and the height here and get this difference, and that's how far down we want to start rendering. So that's pretty easy to do. We already have our canvas, and we can easily say canvas.height to get that. So let's come in and say canvas.height, and then we want to subtract off the score, which is the 100, the 90, and so on and so forth, off of that. So let's run it. And there we go. That looks pretty good. So we have our base here. We now have our bars lining up as appropriate, and we have our nice little gap between them. And as mentioned, we could easily change the colors if we wanted by simply adding a little logic into the score here. And if it was in, like I said, the 90 to 100 range, maybe we do green, and we'd simply change the fill style in the loop based on some different logic. What if there was a problem with this? Let's do a quick debugging technique here. Fortunately, tools like IE9 or Chrome or Firefox with Firebug make it pretty easy to find issues. So let's say that I, for instance, accidentally snuck a var on here, which of course would be wrong. How do we find out what's wrong easily? Because as you're writing a lot of Canvas code, and as we get further along in the course and get more and more code going, it's definitely going to be a little tricky to debug unless you know some different tricks you can use. So we'll come in, and I'm going to launch this again in Chrome. And what I'm going to do here is you'll notice nothing rendered, and that's because of that var I threw in there. So what I can do is hit either Control-Shift-I or F12, either way, and this pulls up the debugger type tools. And I can come over and right away down here in the bottom right, you'll see I have one error. And if I click that, it says we have an unexpected token. And if I click on the rectangles HTML line 14 over here, we can get the actual area. So this always follows the error. And we can see this line right here is the problem. And it makes it pretty easy to now go in and fix that. So let's go in and do that. Take it out. Let's run it again. But I'm going to go back into the developer tool here, and let's say that we wanted to actually debug this a little bit. Well, we can actually click on scripts, and I can select the script. I only have one right now because the script is in line with the HTML, and you can see it. So if I wanted to actually set a breakpoint and debug this, I can click over here in Chrome, and it works very similar in IE as well as Firebug, especially Firebug's very, very similar. And now I can go ahead and refresh the page, and you'll notice that my breakpoint gets hit. Now from here, these are my step into, step out, step over, or I can hit some hotkeys. So for instance, I can hit F10 to step over, I can hit F11 to step into, and do those types of things. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit these guys over here, and you'll see the different hotkeys, and we'll go ahead and step in here. And now we're obviously in the loop, and there's our first one that just got drawn. And you see as I click, we can actually see those render. So that's a really nice technique to know, because if you get an error, you can hit F12 or Control-Shift-I, and you can go in, see if there's an error over here, and it makes it very easy to identify where that error may be located. So that's kind of an initial example of using the HTML5 canvas to do something a little more useful. And as we move along in the course, we're going to keep building on this concept, and I'll show other things we can do as well.